Buddha's Noble Truth of Rebirth. 10 Facts You've Never Heard Before. The word Samvega, spelled the same in Pali and Sanskrit, comes from a verbal root meaning to tremble or to move in agitation, and is sometimes translated simply as fear. It is a special kind of fear, however, one that is useful and beneficial, and that has a positive sense relating to the teachings of the Buddha. To move his listeners from mundane right view to transcendent right view, the Buddha used the teaching on rebirth to inspire not only a sense of heedfulness in his listeners, but also a sense of Samvega, dismay and terror at the prospect of not gaining release from rebirth. Long have you, repeatedly, experienced the death of a mother, the tears you have shed over the death of a mother while transmigrating and wandering this long time, crying and weeping from being joined with what is displeasing, being separated from what is pleasing, are greater than the water in the 4 great oceans. Long have you, repeatedly, experienced the death of a father, the death of a brother, the death of a sister, the death of a son, the death of a daughter, loss with regard to relatives, loss with regard to wealth, loss with regard to disease. The tears you have shed over loss with regard to disease while transmigrating and wandering this long time, crying and weeping from being joined with what is displeasing, being separated from what is pleasing, are greater than the water in the 4 great oceans. Why is that? From an inconceivable beginning comes transmigration. A beginning point is not evident, though beings hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving are transmigrating and wandering on. Long have you thus experienced stress, experienced pain, experienced loss, swelling the cemeteries, enough to become disenchanted with all fabricated things, enough to become dispassionate, enough to be released. Samyutta Nikaya, SN 15.3, Asu Sutta, Tears. The relationship between heedfulness and Samvega parallels the relationship between the second knowledge of the night of the Buddha's awakening and the third. Seeing the way in which rebirth depends on one's views and actions, he saw the need for heedfulness in one's thoughts, words, and deeds. Seeing the precarious complexity and pointlessness of the whole process of repeated death and rebirth, he developed the sense of Samvega that inspired him to look for a way out. The way he chose, and that gave results, was to take the lessons about rebirth obtained in his first 2 knowledges and to apply them to the actions of the mind in the present moment and to their effects both in the present and over time. In doing so, he arrived at the 4 noble truths as the form of right view that would lead to total release and the end of rebirth. The connection between rebirth and the first noble truth is reflected in the fact that this truth lists birth as one of the forms of suffering that the 4th noble truth brings to an end. In fact, birth stands at the beginning of the list. Now this, monks, is the noble truth of stress. Birth is stressful, aging is stressful, death is stressful, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair are stressful. Association with the unbeloved is stressful. Separation from the loved is stressful. Not getting what is wanted is stressful. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are stressful. SN 56.11. The connection between rebirth and the second noble truth is reflected in the fact that this truth defines the cause of suffering as any form of craving or clinging that leads to further becoming, which is the condition for further birth. And this, monks, is the noble truth of the origination of stress, the craving that makes for further becoming, accompanied by passion and delight, relishing now here and now there. That is, craving for sensuality, craving for becoming, craving for non-becoming. Samyutta Nikaya, ASN 56.11, Dhammacakkappavattana, Sutta setting the wheel of Dhamma in motion. Does full justice to what the Buddha had to say. Writers who reject the idea that the Buddha is talking about the rebirth of a person in these two noble truths tend to argue in one of two ways. Either that the references to birth don't imply rebirth, or that they refer to rebirth on the micro level of momentary mind states, and not on the macro level of beings or persons over time. Neither interpretation, however, does full justice to what the Buddha had to say. Writers in the first group have made much of the fact that the Buddha used the word birth rather than rebirth in the first noble truth, concluding that rebirth is not necessarily meant here. This conclusion, though, ignores the relationship of the first truth to the others. All the forms of suffering listed in the first truth are caused by the second truth and brought to an end by the fourth. If birth were a one-shot affair, there would be, for a person already born, no point in looking for the causes of the suffering of birth, and no way that the fourth truth could put an end to them. This point is especially clear when we look at the Buddha's own account of how he explored the causes of suffering after having seen in his first two knowledges the sufferings caused by repeated birth. He looked into the possible causes of birth and traced them deep into the mind. Monks, before my awakening, when I was still just an unawakened bodhisattva, the realization came to me, how this world has fallen on difficulty. It is born, it ages, it dies, it falls away and re-arises, but it does not discern the escape from this stress, from this aging and death. Oh, when will it discern the escape from this stress, from this aging and death? Then the thought occurred to me, aging and death exist when what exists. From what as a requisite condition come aging and death. From my appropriate attention there came the breakthrough of discernment. Aging and death exist when birth exists. From birth as a requisite condition comes aging and death. Then the thought occurred to me, birth exists when what exists. From what as a requisite condition comes birth. From my appropriate attention there came the breakthrough of discernment. Birth exists when becoming exists. From becoming as a requisite condition comes birth. Becoming exists when what exists. Clinging sustenance exists when what exists. Craving exists when what exists. Feeling exists when what exists. Contact exists when what exists. The sixth sense media exist when what exists. Name and form exists when what exists. From what as a requisite condition is their name and form. From my appropriate attention there came the breakthrough of discernment. Name and form exists when consciousness exists. From consciousness as a requisite condition comes name and form. Then the thought occurred to me, consciousness exists when what exists. From what as a requisite condition comes consciousness. From my appropriate attention there came the breakthrough of discernment. Consciousness exists when name and form exists. From name and form as a requisite condition comes consciousness. Then the thought occurred to me, this consciousness turns back at name and form and goes no farther. It is to this extent that there is birth, aging, death, falling away and reappearing. That is, from name and form as a requisite condition comes consciousness. From consciousness as a requisite condition comes name and form. From name and form as a requisite condition come the six sense media. Thus is the origination of this entire mass of stress. Origination, origination. Vision arose, clear knowing arose, discernment arose, knowledge arose, illumination arose within me with regard to things never heard before. Samyutta Nikaya SN 12.65 Nagara Sutta, the city, Sutta. Buddha's analysis of dependent co-arising. Had the Buddha assumed that birth were a one-time affair, he wouldn't have explored its causes through becoming, clinging, and on down to name and form. He would have stopped his analysis of the causes of suffering at the realization, aging and death exist when birth exists. From birth as a requisite condition comes aging and death. He thus would have limited his analysis of the origination of suffering to what happens after birth. Only because he saw that birth was a repeated process did he probe into the causes of birth and trace them through the factors that he later taught in his description of dependent co-arising. In other words, if the Buddha hadn't assumed rebirth, he never would have discovered or taught the central tenets of his teaching, the Four Noble Truths and dependent co-arising. His analysis of suffering and its causes would have been much more limited in scope. And as we will see, the Buddha discovered that the processes leading to suffering are self-sustaining, meaning that unless they are deliberately starved, they will continue repeating indefinitely. In this way, not only birth but also every factor in dependent co-arising is prefixed with an implicit from re-ignorance to re-death. As for the argument that the birth mentioned in the First Noble Truth could be a repeated process, but only on the micro scale of the momentary arising of mental states, the fact that the Buddha discovered the Four Noble Truths and the factors of dependent co-arising by examining mental events in the present moment would seem to lend credence to this interpretation. But it ignores two important points. The first is that when the Buddha himself explained birth, aging, and death in the context of these teachings, he did so with reference to birth on the macro scale, that is, the birth, aging, and death of a person. Now, which aging and death? Whatever aging, decrepitude, brokenness, graying, wrinkling, decline of life force, weakening of the faculties of the various beings in this or that group of beings, that is called aging. Whatever deceasing, passing away, breaking up, disappearance, dying, death, completion of time, breakup of the aggregates, casting off of the body, interruption in the life faculty of the various beings in this or that group of beings, that is called death. And which birth? Whatever birth, taking birth, descent, coming to be, coming forth, appearance of aggregates, and acquisition of sense media of the various beings in this or that group of beings, that is called birth. Samyutta Nikaya, SN 12.2, Paticca Samuppada Vibhanga, Sutta, Analysis of Dependent Co-arising. Part of the strategy to put an end to suffering. The second point is that to insist on limiting the Four Noble Truths and the factors of dependent co-arising to one scale or the other is to miss a crucial feature of these teachings. Remember that the Buddha's third knowledge came from applying to the micro-level lessons learned on the macro level in the first two knowledges. The lesson he learned as a result is that the level of scale is a relative affair. The process is the constant. To compare this to modern physics, it was like Einstein's proposal that the dimensions of space and time are not constants. The constant is the speed of light. The fact that the Buddha gained release by discovering a process that held constant across many levels of scale was reflected in the way he taught, often switching scales in the course of his discussions and refusing to be pinned down to one scale or another. Sometimes he talked about beings in the standard sense of the word, and sometimes as attachments, Samyutta Nikaya 23.2, that is, as processes on the mental level, and in particular with dependent co-arising. The teaching is always presented as a process without a fixed reference to where, on the level of scale in the world or in the individual, the factors of the process are playing out. In this way, it's like a photograph of erosion patterns. Without an extraneous object such as a tree or an insect to indicate scale, it's difficult to know whether the range of the photograph covers 2 miles or 2 inches, whether the erosion runs through a vast plateau or a small patch of sand by the side of a road, and whether the eroded bits in the photograph are boulders or grains of sand. Either way, the photograph can be studied to understand the complex causal patterns underlying erosion, and, more to the point, we can learn more about the processes of erosion by studying it on multiple levels than by limiting ourselves to just one. In the same way, it's a mistake to limit the Buddha's teachings on birth for a rebirth to just one level of scale. To limit them just to the micro level is to underestimate the potential for mental events in the present to create long-term suffering, and the radical nature of the cure needed to put an end to that suffering. To limit his teachings just to the macro level makes it impossible to observe directly in the present how birth and its attendant sufferings come about and can be brought to an end. To get the most out of these teachings, it's best to drop any insistence in line with one's metaphysical assumptions that they apply to one level and not another. Instead, it's better to look at the processes as processes, true across many scales, and use this way of framing the issue as part of the strategy to put an end to suffering. An appropriate frame. As part of his policy of not getting pinned down on issues of scale when presenting the process of rebirth, the Buddha was careful to avoid an issue that animated his contemporaries when they discussed rebirth: the metaphysics of what a person is, and what does or doesn't get reborn after death. In other words, he refused to explain whether any what underlay the experience of rebirth. He simply talked about how the experience happened and what could be done to end it. In modern philosophy, this approach is called phenomenology, talking about the phenomena of experience simply in terms of direct experience, without making reference to any underlying reality that may or may not stand behind that experience. The Buddha was a radical phenomenologist in that he dealt with experience on its own terms. He was a pragmatist in that he adopted this approach because he saw that it worked in bringing suffering to an end. The canon reports that the members of the other schools, and even some of his own monks, often expressed frustration over this aspect of the Buddha's approach. Majjhima Nikaya 63, Anguttara Nikaya 10.93. In their eyes, the whole question of rebirth revolved around the what that did or didn't get reborn. Either the life force was identical with the body, thus allowing no way for rebirth to occur after the body dies, or else there was a soul or life force separate from the body, which either died along with the body or else survived death. Yet when the Buddha's contemporaries pressed him to take sides on this question and related questions, he consistently put them aside. The Blessed One said, "From ignorance as a requisite condition come fabrications. From becoming as a requisite condition comes birth." When this was said, a certain monk said to the Blessed One, "Which is the birth, Lord, and whose is the birth, or the birth of what?" "Not a valid question," the Blessed One said. "If one were to ask, which is the birth and whose is the birth? And if one were to say, birth is one thing, and the birth is that of something, someone else, both of them would have the same meaning, even though their words would differ. When there is the view that the soul is the same as the body, there is no leading the holy life. And when there is the view that the soul is one thing and the body another, there is no leading the holy life. Avoiding these two extremes, the Tathagata teaches the Dhamma via the middle. From becoming as a requisite condition comes birth. Samyutta Nikaya, SN 12.35, Avijjapakaya, Sutta, from ignorance as a requisite condition. Monks, there are these 4 nutriments for the maintenance of beings who have come into being or for the support of those in search of a place to be born. Which 4? Physical food, gross or refined, contact as the 2nd, intellectual intention the 3rd, and consciousness the 4th. These are the 4 nutriments for the maintenance of beings who have come into being or for the support of those in search of a place to be born. When this was said, then Mollia Faguna said to the Blessed One, Lord, who feeds on the consciousness nutriment? Not a valid question, the Blessed One said. I don't say feeds. If I were to say feeds, then who feeds on the consciousness nutriment would be a valid question. But I don't say that. When I don't say that, the valid question is, consciousness nutriment for what? And the valid answer is, consciousness nutriment for the production of future coming into being. When that has come into being and exists, then the 6 sense media are experienced. From the 6 sense media as a requisite condition comes contact. Samyutta Nikaya SN 12.12, Faguna Sutta to Faguna. Exploring the process, dependent co-arising and the illusion of self. The tendency to read a thing or no thing behind the processes of dependent co-arising is still alive with us today. Many people have assumed that the Buddha taught that there is no self, which means that there would be no thing behind the process of dependent co-arising and nothing to be reborn. Many others have assumed that he taught a true self underlying our false sense of an individual self, and therefore underlying the process. Both assumptions, however, are misinformed. The Buddha actually refused to state whether a self of any kind does or doesn't exist. The one recorded time he was asked point-blank whether the self exists, he declined to answer. Samyutta Nikaya SN 44.10. This was because he saw that questions of this sort interfere with the path of practice leading to the end of suffering. As he said in Majjhima Nikaya MN2, to focus on such questions as, am I? Am I not? What am I? What was I in the past? What will I be in the future? Is a form of inappropriate attention, the kind of attention that ignores the 4 noble truths and actually leads to further suffering. So if a worldview demands an explanation of the what behind rebirth, as we find not only in the worldviews of ancient India but also in many modern worldviews as well, it's simply a form of inappropriate attention that perpetuates suffering. If you want to put an end to suffering, you have to put the metaphysical demands of your worldview aside. The Buddha found it more appropriate and fruitful to focus instead on the process of how birth is repeatedly generated by factors immediately present to awareness throughout life and directly experienced by factors in the present moment. This is because these factors lie enough under your control to turn them toward the ending of repeated rebirth. An understanding of the process as process, and in particular, as an example of the process of dependent co-arising, can actually contribute to the end of suffering. It gives guidance in how to apply the tasks appropriate for the 4 noble truths to the process of birth. That is, comprehending suffering, abandoning its cause, realizing its cessation, and developing the path to its cessation. When these duties have been completely mastered, they can bring birth to an end by abandoning its causes, thus opening the way to the ultimate happiness that comes when the mind is no longer entangled in the process of birth. The Buddha used several models for explaining the process of dependent co-arising, with each model listing a sequence of interdependent factors. In the most standard model, the factors are these: ignorance of how to apply the 4 noble truths, fabrications, intentional acts shaping the experience of body, speech, and mind, consciousness, at the 6 senses, counting the mind as the 6th, name and form, mental phenomena, intention, attention, feeling, perception, and contact, and physical phenomena, the body as experienced from within in terms of energy, warmth, liquidity, and solidity. The six sense media, counting the mind as the sixth. Contact at the sixth sense media. Feeling of pleasure, pain, or neither pleasure nor pain based on that contact. Craving for sensuality, for becoming or for non-becoming. Clinging to sensuality, habits and practices, views and doctrines of the self. Becoming, the assumption of an identity in a particular world of experience on the level of sensuality, form or formlessness, and birth into that identity, followed by the suffering of aging, illness, and death. How dependent co-arising explains birth and suffering. This list has many complications, with certain factors appearing at several points in the sequence. For example, the factor of ignorance is identical with the sub-factor of inappropriate attention under name and form. The list also contains many feedback loops, sequences where an effect returns to influence the next instance of its cause. As we will see, the existence of feedback loops in the process is what makes it self-sustaining and gives it the potential to continue indefinitely. For the moment, however, we can focus on one of dependent co-arising's most obvious features: its lack of outside context. It avoids any reference to the presence or absence of a self or a world around the processes it describes. Instead, it forms the context for understanding selves and worlds. In other words, it shows how ideas of such metaphysical contexts are created and clung to, and what happens as a result. In particular, it shows in detail how the acts of creating and clinging to metaphysical assumptions about the existence or non-existence of the self or the world actually lead to birth and suffering. This means that dependent co-arising, instead of existing in a metaphysical context, provides the phenomenological context for showing why metaphysical contexts are best put aside. The important factors leading from metaphysical assumptions to rebirth are name, contact, clinging, and becoming. Under name is the sub-factor of attention, which Majjhima Nikaya MN2, as we have seen, depicts as the act of choosing which questions to ask. When attention is inappropriately directed to questions of the metaphysics of identity, about what you are or whether you exist, it entangles you in a thicket of views, a writhing of views that keep you trapped in suffering and stress. As for views of what the world is and where it came from, the Buddha shows that these all derive from contact at the six senses. These views about self and world then become objects of clinging, which in turn gives rise to becoming. The act of taking on an identity within a particular world of experience defined around the craving underlying that clinging. Becoming, in turn, is the condition for repeated birth. The antidote to this process is to direct attention appropriately to identifying the Four Noble Truths as they're experienced. This form of attention enables you to see the act of view formation as a process, to see the drawbacks of the process, and so to abandon any clinging to the content of those views. This removes the conditions for further becoming and birth. Even though the Four Noble Truths count as a type of view, their ability to see all views, even themselves, as part of this process means that they contain the seeds for their own transcendence. Anguttara Nikaya 10.93. So if you want to get the most use out of dependent co-arising, then rather than viewing dependent co-arising as occurring within the context of self and world, you'd do better to view ideas of self and world as occurring within the context of dependent co-arising. The advantage of adopting this approach is that it focuses attention away from things for which you aren't responsible, metaphysical entities that may or may not underlie experience, and points instead to events for which you are, acts of attention and the various forms of intention under fabrications and name. This is why, even though the Buddha didn't take a stand on the issues of the metaphysics of rebirth, he devoted a lot of time to explaining the connection between rebirth and action. Action is what leads to rebirth, but action, skillful action, can also bring it to an end. Conclusion section. When you adopt this perspective, you focus directly on actions as they are experienced as factors, parts of a causal sequence. And this, in turn, makes it easier to apply the duties of the Four Noble Truths with greater precision. In other words, it helps you notice which factors, such as ignorance, cause suffering and so should be abandoned by replacing them with right view. Which ones, such as attention and intention under name, can be converted to the path to the end of suffering, and so should be developed before they too are abandoned. And which ones, such as clinging, becoming, and birth, constitute suffering, and so should be comprehended to the point of disenchantment and dispassion, leading to the realization of the end of suffering.